one that whispers through the cracks of forgotten libraries and over the lips of old travelers who drink alone in dimly lit bars. It's not the kind of tale people repeat lightly. It clings to you like damp clothes after a storm, weighing you down, chilling you to the marrow. But if you're here, listening, then you've already chosen to let it in. Just don't say I didn't warn you. The story begins with an unassuming object, a simple box, carved from a dark wood that seemed to drink in the light. No ornamentation, no hinges visible from the outside. Just smooth, cold wood and the faintest scent of something ancient, like the earth of a freshly dug grave. The kind of thing you might find at a flea market and think, this will look great on my shelf. But you'd be wrong. Dead wrong. It was found in the attic of a crumbling Victorian house in New England, a house no one had lived in for decades. The kind of place that had more history than anyone cared to remember, because the history wasn't pleasant. The last owner, a recluse named Agnes Blackwell, had vanished without a trace in the 1920s. No body, no note, just a half-eaten meal on the table and a locked attic door that no one could open until much later. When the new owners finally broke through that attic door, it was as if they'd stepped into another world. Dust hung in the air like mist over a swamp. And there, sitting in the center of the room on a pedestal of cobwebs, was the box. They should have left it there. Hell, they should have set the whole place on fire and walked away. But curiosity is a cruel master. The box made its way to an antique dealer named Edward Harper. Harper was the kind of man who could smell profit in a pile of garbage. He wasn't interested in the box itself, it was the story that came with it. He believed every object had a tale, and if he told it well enough, people would pay more for it. But this time, the object had a story of its own, a story that didn't need his embellishments. The first sign that something was wrong came the night Harper brought the box home. His dog, a loyal mutt named Cooper, refused to go near it. The animal stood at the door of Harper's study, growling low in its throat, the hackles on its back standing straight up. Harper laughed it off. "It's just a box, you dumb mutt," he said, patting the dog on the head. But the dog wouldn't budge. Later that night, Harper woke to a sound. At first, he thought it was the wind, a low, mournful wail that seemed to drift through the walls. But then he realized it was coming from the study. He told himself it was nothing, that maybe a window was open. But his feet carried him down the hall, his pulse thundering in his ears. The study was dark, save for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The box sat on his desk, as still and silent as ever. He approached it slowly, every nerve in his body screaming at him to turn around. But he didn't. He reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the smooth surface. The box was warm. Not the kind of warmth that comes from the sun or a heater. This was a living warmth, like the heat of another person's skin. Harper snatched his hand back, heart hammering in his chest. But before he could take another step, the lid of the box began to slide open on its own. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. Not an empty void, but a depth that seemed to stretch on forever. He could feel it pulling at him, tugging at the edges of his mind. And then, from that impossible darkness, he heard it, a whisper. Faint at first, like the rustle of dry leaves. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it was a chorus of voices, each one overlapping the next, pleading, begging, screaming. "Help us." The lid slammed shut with a force that shook the desk, and Harper stumbled back, gasping for air. His mind reeled, but the words were etched into his brain. "Help us." By the next morning, Harper convinced himself it had been a dream. Stress, maybe. Too much bourbon before bed. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed him wherever he went, growing louder and more desperate with each passing hour. And then the shadows began to move. It started small, a flicker in the corner of his eye, the briefest hint of motion where there should have been none. But soon, the shadows were no longer content to remain in the corners. They slithered across the walls, pooling in the corners of rooms, stretching long fingers toward him. They didn't touch him, not at first. But he could feel their cold breath on his neck, the icy prickle of their gaze. Harper turned to the only person he thought could help, an old friend named Margaret Lowe, a historian with a penchant for the occult. If anyone could unravel the mystery of the box, it was her. Margaret didn't waste any time. She pored over the box, running her fingers over the wood, murmuring incantations in languages Harper didn't recognize. Finally, she looked up at him, her face pale and drawn. "This isn't a box," she said. "It's a prison." Harper laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "A prison for what? Shadows? Voices?" Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she opened a book, its pages yellowed with age, and began to read. The words spilled from her lips like a curse, filling the room with a weight that pressed down on Harper's chest. She told him of an ancient cult, long forgotten, who believed they could trap the souls of the damned in physical objects, binding them for eternity. The box, she said, was one of their creations, a vessel for those who had committed the unforgivable. "And now," she said, her voice trembling, "they want out." At that moment, the air grew cold, and the lights flickered. The shadows surged forward, no longer content to watch. Harper and Margaret were plunged into darkness, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar. "Let us out!" Margaret screamed. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in a moment of fear. It was primal, guttural, as if something was being torn from her. Harper stumbled back, colliding with the wall as the shadows enveloped her. They didn't just cover her, they consumed her, dragging her toward the box. Her hands clawed at the floor, her eyes wild, pleading. "Edward," she shrieked, her voice almost unrecognizable. "Don't let them take me." But Harper couldn't move. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of what he was seeing. The shadows twisted and writhed, pulling Margaret closer to the box until she was inches away. And then, just as her hand brushed its surface, the lid snapped open again. This time, there was no gradual slide, no eerie slowness. The lid flew open with a force that sent papers and books flying off the desk. The darkness inside wasn't empty anymore. Faces pressed against the edges, gaunt, hollow-eyed faces with mouths stretched wide in silent screams. They weren't trying to escape. They were reaching for her. Margaret's body jerked forward, her scream cutting off as if someone had yanked the sound from her throat. In a flash, she was gone, pulled into the box with such ferocity that the air itself seemed to snap like a rubber band. The lid slammed shut, and the room was silent. Harper collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His mind reeled, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Margaret was gone. Not dead, no, death would have been merciful. She was somewhere else now, trapped in that infinite darkness, just like the others. For hours, Harper sat there, staring at the box, too afraid to touch it, too terrified to leave it unattended. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. It was oppressive, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He knew he couldn't keep the box. Not anymore. Margaret's words echoed in his mind, "They want out." He had to get rid of it. But how do you destroy something that doesn't belong to this world? Harper drove to the outskirts of town, the box wrapped in a thick blanket in the trunk of his car. The sun was rising, casting long shadows over the empty road. He didn't have a plan, just a desperate hope that he could bury it, burn it, throw it into the ocean, anything to put as much distance as possible between him and that cursed thing. But the box had other plans. As he turned onto a desolate stretch of highway, the engine sputtered and died. The car coasted to a stop, and Harper slammed his fists against the wheel, cursing under his breath. He climbed out, the crisp morning air biting at his skin, and popped the trunk. The blanket was gone. The box sat there, bare and exposed, as if mocking him. Its surface gleamed in the pale light, almost alive. Harper reached for it, intending to hurl it into the trees, but the moment his fingers touched the wood, the world shifted. It wasn't the kind of shift you'd notice right away. No earthquake, no sudden drop. But the sky darkened, the air thickened, and the sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, fell silent. And then, a voice. Not a whisper this time. A voice, deep and resonant, filling the air around him. "You can't get rid of me, Edward." Harper froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The box didn't answer. Instead, it began to hum, a low vibration that he could feel in his bones. The lid creaked open again, and a tendril of shadow slithered out, coiling around his wrist. He tried to pull away, but it held him fast. The shadow wasn't cold like he expected. It was warm, pulsing with a sickly heat, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The voice spoke again, closer this time, as if it were coming from inside his own head. "We want you." Harper's vision blurred. Images flashed before his eyes, faces he didn't recognize, places he'd never been, all of them consumed by darkness. He saw Margaret, her face twisted in agony, her hands clawing at an invisible barrier. And then he saw himself. Not as he was now, but as something else. A husk. Hollow. Eyes black as the void, skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too fragile to hold him together. "No!" Harper screamed, wrenching his arm free. The tendril snapped back into the box, and the lid slammed shut. He staggered back, gasping, his entire body trembling. The box sat there, silent and unmoving, as if nothing had happened. But Harper knew better. This wasn't over. It would never be over. Harper stumbled back to his car, his legs barely holding him up. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the silence that surrounded him. He didn't care about the stalled engine anymore. He had to get away, even if it meant running on foot. But as he turned toward the road, he froze. The shadows were there, stretching unnaturally long across the pavement, even though the sun had risen. They flickered and danced, whispering his name. "Edward. Edward. Edward, asterisk asterisk." He spun around to face the box, now sitting perfectly still in the open trunk, mocking him with its stillness. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to leave it and never look back. But he knew he couldn't. It wouldn't let him. Harper's breathing grew ragged as he wrestled with his thoughts. Margaret's fate haunted him. He couldn't let this cursed object find another victim. He had to end it, even if it meant risking his own soul. The whispers grew louder, blending into a low, guttural chant. Harper felt his grip on reality slipping as the shadows closed in, circling him like predators. Summoning every ounce of resolve, he reached into the trunk, grabbed the box, and slammed the lid shut with a force that echoed through the stillness. The chanting stopped. The air grew thin, pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. For a moment, everything was eerily still, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Then, the voice returned, low, deliberate, and filled with malice. "You can't destroy what doesn't belong to you." Harper gritted his teeth. "Watch me." He drove his fist into the side of the box, splintering the wood. A surge of heat shot through his hand, searing his skin, but he didn't stop. He smashed it again and again, splinters flying, shadows writhing in agony around him. Each strike sent a shockwave through the air, as if the fabric of reality itself were protesting his defiance. The box cracked open, spilling its contents, not darkness, but light. Blinding, brilliant light that burned like the heart of a star. From within it, voices erupted, not whispers, but cries of anguish, relief, and something that might have been gratitude. Faces emerged from the shards of the box, their features etched with pain and hope. One of them was Margaret. She reached for Harper, her translucent hand trembling as it brushed his. "You broke it," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You freed us." Before he could respond, the light grew brighter, enveloping everything. Harper screamed, shielding his eyes, but the light pierced through, filling him with a searing heat. The last thing he heard was Margaret's voice, soft and steady, like a lullaby. "Thank you." When Harper woke, he was lying in the middle of the road. The box was gone. The air was still, the sun shining brightly overhead. For a moment, he thought it might have all been a dream. But the burn marks on his hand told him otherwise. The voices were gone. The shadows no longer lingered in the corners of his vision. But deep down, Harper knew the story wasn't over. Because as he stood there, staring at the empty trunk of his car, he realized something chilling. The box hadn't been destroyed. It had moved on. Somewhere, someone else would find it, a stranger in an attic, a curious buyer at a flea market, a fool in search of something extraordinary. And the cycle would begin again. Harper stood on that desolate road for a long time, staring at the spot where the box had been. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight gone, but an ache settled deep in his chest. It wasn't relief. It was dread. He had destroyed it, or thought he had. He had seen the light, felt the heat, heard the voices. But now, standing there alone, he couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched. Something had changed. When he finally returned to town, his body was battered, and his mind was racing. He parked his car in his driveway, but his home didn't feel the same. The curtains seemed heavier, the air stale and damp. Shadows collected in corners that had always been bathed in light. Harper shook his head, trying to convince himself it was paranoia. Days turned into weeks, but the feeling never left him. At first, it was subtle, fleeting chills, creaking floorboards, the sensation of a hand brushing past him when no one was there. Then, it became undeniable. He woke one night to whispers, low and guttural, coming from the hallway. "Edward! Edward!" Harper bolted upright in bed, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand and flicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. The whispers stopped. His breath came in short gasps as he crept toward the hallway, the wooden floorboards groaning under his weight. Every step felt like an eternity. When he reached the end of the hall, he stopped, shining the light into the living room. It was empty. But then he saw it, etched into the wall above the fireplace. A series of deep scratches, as if something with claws had carved them there. 5 long, jagged lines, all pointing downward. Harper staggered back, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He didn't understand what it meant, but he knew it wasn't good. The whispers returned the next night, louder this time. Harper tried to drown them out with music, but they only grew more insistent, weaving themselves into the melody until it was all he could hear. "Edward, you can't run." He tried ignoring them, but they followed him everywhere, to the grocery store, to his office, even in the shower. The shadows moved when they shouldn't, stretching toward him like grasping fingers. Then came the dreams. Every night, he found himself back on that road, staring at the box. But in the dream, it wasn't broken. It sat there, whole and untouched, its lid slightly ajar. Inside, he could see Margaret, her face pale and ghostly, her lips moving silently. "Let me out," she whispered. "No," Harper said, shaking his head. "You're free. I freed you." But Margaret only smiled, a slow, eerie curve of her lips. "You thought you could break the curse?" she asked. "You didn't free us, Edward. You replaced us." He jolted awake, his body drenched in sweat. The words echoed in his mind, a cruel revelation taking root. He wasn't rid of the curse. He was part of it now. The scratches on the walls grew overnight, spreading like a disease. Symbols began to form, ancient, indecipherable runes that glowed faintly in the dark. Harper tried painting over them, but they reappeared within hours, sharper and more vivid than before. One evening, as he sat in his living room, exhausted and defeated, he felt the air shift. It was the same oppressive stillness he'd felt on the road. The whispers rose around him, circling like a storm. "Do you understand now?" the voice boomed, deep and resonant, filling the room. Harper didn't respond. "You thought you could escape us," the voice continued. "But you've only taken their place. The box may be gone, but the curse is eternal." Harper clenched his fists, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The shadows moved closer, pressing against him like a living thing. "It's not what we want, Edward. It's what you've become." His heart sank as the truth dawned on him. He hadn't destroyed the box. He hadn't broken the cycle. He was the vessel now. The light in the room dimmed, and Harper felt the familiar pull of the darkness, warm, alive, and insatiable. He knew then that there was no escape. The cursed relic was no longer an object. It was him. Harper sank into his armchair, staring at his trembling hands. They didn't look like his own anymore. Pale, lined with faint cracks that glowed in eerie silver in the dim light, they felt alien, as though they belonged to something else entirely. For days, he locked himself inside the house, avoiding mirrors, avoiding people. He feared what he might see, what they might see. But isolation offered no sanctuary. The walls whispered, the floors groaned, and the symbols that marred every surface now pulsed faintly, as though breathing. Harper began to hear stories around town. A local teenager disappeared near the woods where Harper had first encountered the box. The boy's parents reported finding strange symbols carved into the trees, eerily similar to those on Harper's walls. Soon after, an elderly couple on the outskirts of town was found in their home, their faces frozen in silent screams. The only clue? An unnatural, dark residue smeared across their floors, like the shadows themselves had crept in and devoured them. Harper knew it was connected. Somehow, it all led back to him. He tried to resist the growing pull inside him, but the box's influence, its will, was relentless. Every night, he dreamed of it calling out to strangers, beckoning them closer. He would see their faces in vivid detail, a woman walking her dog, a man closing his shop for the night, a child chasing a ball down an alley. In his dreams, he was there, guiding them, leading them to their doom. When he awoke, his stomach churned with guilt, but it was the physical toll that frightened him most. His reflection in the bathroom mirror revealed hollows beneath his eyes and veins that glowed faintly in the dark. His pupils, once brown, now shimmered with the same silvery hue as the cracks in his skin. The house grew colder. No matter how many blankets he piled on or how high he turned the thermostat, a deep, bone-chilling cold permeated the air. And then, one night, the whispers became voices. "You're the keeper now, Edward." The voice was low and ancient, speaking with a finality that left no room for denial. Harper shivered, his breath visible in the icy air. "I didn't choose this," he whispered. "But you touched it," the voice replied. "And that is all it takes." Desperation clawed at him. Harper began to research the symbols that adorned his walls, spending sleepless nights scouring ancient texts, forums, and obscure articles. His search led him to a name, Armoros, an ancient entity linked to cursed artifacts and forbidden knowledge. The name appeared repeatedly in accounts of missing persons and strange, unexplainable deaths throughout history. In every story, there was always one common thread, a keeper. Someone who bore the burden of the curse, guiding the box to its next victim. Harper refused to believe he was beyond saving. There had to be a way out. He tracked down a local occultist, an eccentric woman named Lila who lived on the edge of town. Her house was cluttered with candles, jars of herbs, and arcane books. She listened intently as Harper explained his ordeal, her expression growing darker with every word. "You don't destroy something like this," Lila said after a long pause. "You contain it. If the box is gone, its power has merged with you. That makes you a conduit." "A conduit for what?" Harper asked, his voice tight. "For Armoros. You're a doorway now. If you lose control, it won't just be you, it'll consume everything around you." Her words struck like a thunderclap. Harper pressed his hands to his face, fighting the despair that threatened to swallow him. "So, what do I do?" Lila leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Seal yourself away. If you can isolate the entity, sever its connection to others, you might be able to contain its spread. But it won't be easy. It will fight you every step of the way." Harper left Lila's house with a plan, but also with the heavy weight of what it meant. He couldn't just walk away from his life. He had to cut himself off entirely. The following day, he packed what little he could carry and drove deep into the mountains, far from anyone who might stumble upon him, or worse, upon whatever he was becoming. He found an abandoned cabin and began his self-imposed exile, hoping the isolation would keep the entity from spreading. But the curse didn't rest. Even in the solitude of the forest, the shadows found him. They stretched long in the firelight, whispering promises and threats, tempting him to abandon his efforts. The cabin's walls, once bare, began to manifest the same symbols that had haunted his home in town. One night, Harper woke to the sound of scratching. Something, or someone, was outside, clawing at the door. "Edward," a voice called, soft and pleading. "Help me. Please." It was Margaret's voice. He froze, his heart racing. He knew it couldn't be real, knew it was another trick, but the sound of her sobs cut through him like a knife. "Edward, why did you leave me?" Tears welled in his eyes as he clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay rooted in place. "You're not real," he muttered, over and over, as the sobs turned to laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. The cabin's windows rattled, and the fire sputtered out, leaving him in darkness. The entity was angry now. It had been denied its prey. Harper sat in the pitch black, his resolve firm but his sanity unraveling. He understood now that this wasn't just about him. As long as he lived, the entity would try to use him, would try to spread its corruption. He had sealed himself away to protect others, but he began to wonder if that would ever be enough. The days blurred into nights, and Harper lost all sense of time. The cabin had become a prison, not just for him, but for the entity inside him. The oppressive silence was only ever broken by the whispers, the scratches, and the occasional burst of malevolent laughter that seemed to erupt from nowhere. Harper tried to keep his mind occupied, scribbling in an old notebook he'd found in the cabin. At first, he wrote down everything he could remember about the box, the symbols, and his encounter with Lila. But as the days dragged on, his entries turned into desperate ramblings. Fragments of thoughts. Incoherent pleas. "I'm still me, aren't I? It's trying to break through again. If someone finds this, don't let it out." But deep down, Harper knew he was losing the battle. One evening, as he sat by the dying embers of his fire, a faint knock echoed from the door. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. It wasn't the frantic scratching of the entity, nor the mocking laughter he had grown accustomed to. This was different. Deliberate. Human. "Hello," a voice called from the other side. Harper's breath caught in his throat. It was a man's voice, unfamiliar and hesitant. "Is someone in there? My car broke down a mile back, and I need help." Harper clenched his fists, his mind racing. He couldn't open the door. He couldn't risk it. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Please. It's freezing out here. I won't stay long. Just let me warm up." The voice tugged at something deep in Harper's chest, a part of him that still remembered what it meant to care, to help. But he shook his head violently, backing away from the door. "Go away," he shouted, his voice hoarse and cracking. "You don't understand. You can't be here." There was silence on the other side, followed by the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the snow. Harper slumped to the floor, relief washing over him. But it was short-lived. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "You can't fight it, Edward. You think you're protecting them, but you're only delaying the inevitable." Harper covered his ears, rocking back and forth. "Leave me alone," he screamed. The laughter erupted again, filling the cabin with its mocking echo. And then, for the first time, the entity spoke with terrifying clarity. "You are the key, Edward. You will open the door." He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he stared at the notebook on the table, its pages filled with his increasingly fragmented thoughts. He realized with a sinking feeling that he was running out of time. The next morning, Harper ventured outside for the first time in weeks. The snow was thick, the air biting, but the forest was eerily quiet. As he walked around the cabin, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Symbols, dozens of them, carved into the trees surrounding the cabin. They formed a perfect circle, enclosing him like a cage. He stumbled back inside, his heart hammering. The entity wasn't just inside him. It was spreading. Harper grabbed his notebook and began writing furiously, detailing everything he had seen and felt. He didn't know if anyone would ever find it, but he needed to leave a record. The final entry read, "Asterisk, the entity is growing stronger. It wants me to open the door, not just the cabin door, but something bigger. Something I can't fully comprehend. If you're reading this, don't trust me. Don't listen to me. Destroy this place and everything in it. It's the only way, asterisk. That night, Harper sat by the fire, his resolve wavering. He thought of Margaret, of Lila's warnings, of the people who had already fallen victim to the curse. And then, as the firelight flickered, he heard it again, the deliberate knock at the door. But this time, it wasn't a stranger. "Edward," the voice called softly. "It's me. Let me in." It was Margaret. Harper's hands trembled as he stared at the door. He knew it couldn't be her. He knew it was a trick. But the voice, her voice, was so familiar, so real. "Please, Edward. I'm cold." Tears streamed down his face as he rose to his feet, his body moving against his will. The whispers grew louder, urging him forward. As his hand reached for the latch, he felt the air around him shift. The fire sputtered out, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. And then, the door creaked open. Harper's heart hammered in his chest as the door slowly creaked open, the cold air rushing in like a silent predator. He could hear nothing but his own breath, shallow and ragged. His fingers, numb with fear, hovered over the doorframe, caught between hesitation and a strange compulsion he couldn't shake. The whispers grew deafening, clawing at the edges of his mind, urging him to step forward. "Edward." The voice again, Margaret's voice. Clear and pleading, as if she were right there, just beyond the threshold. His pulse quickened. He wanted to reach out, to feel her presence, to know she was safe. He missed her so much, the warmth of her touch, the sound of her laughter. But as he stepped closer to the door, a cold wave of nausea washed over him. He knew it wasn't her. He knew, deep down, that it was the entity. Still, he couldn't stop himself. His hand gripped the door, pulling it wider. The darkness outside seemed endless, an abyss of blackness that swallowed up all light, all warmth. And then, just as he was about to step out into it, a figure appeared. A shadow, tall and indistinct, yet its presence felt like a suffocating weight. Harper's breath caught in his throat. The figure stepped forward, and with each movement, the air grew colder. It wasn't Margaret. It was something else. Something older. The figure raised its head, and Harper froze in terror. There, where the face should have been, was nothing but a void, a hollow space where eyes should be. And yet, Harper could feel its gaze piercing through him. "You've opened the door, Edward," it said, its voice a guttural whisper that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the cabin. "Now you must join us." Harper stumbled backward, his legs weak with dread. "No. I won't." But the figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, and as it moved, Harper felt a sudden surge of coldness. His vision blurred, and his skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched, not just by one, but by countless unseen eyes. The whispers grew louder, their words becoming a cacophony of torment. Asterisk, you open the door. You cannot close it now, asterisk. He wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but his body felt heavy, unresponsive. Every step he tried to take away from the figure felt like trudging through deep water, as if some invisible force was holding him in place. Then, as though answering his silent cry for help, a loud cracking sound erupted from the walls. The symbols on the walls of the cabin flickered and writhed, like living things, and the air itself seemed to warp, distorting around the figure. "Edward," the figure crooned. "You are the keeper. You are the key." The words echoed in his mind, and suddenly, Harper understood. He wasn't just a victim. He had been chosen. From the moment he touched the box, he had become a vessel, a doorway between this world and the one beyond. And now, that door was wide open. "Please," Harper whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't want this." But the figure only tilted its head, its hollow gaze locking onto his. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick with the weight of inevitability. "Too late," it whispered. Harper's legs finally gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, unable to break free from the overwhelming presence of the thing before him. His vision flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw the faces of the people who had vanished, the ones he had heard about in the news, the ones he had failed to save. They were there, in the darkness, their eyes empty and pleading, their bodies twisted in unnatural poses. And then, a voice broke through the darkness. It was Lila's voice. Edward, listen to me. You have one chance. You have to sever the connection, cut yourself off from the entity, But Harper couldn't move. His body was no longer his own. The whispers drowned out everything else, and the figure stepped forward once more, its form beginning to flicker and distort like a mirage. Join us, Edward. We are the keepers of the void. You will become one of us, The last shred of Harper's will fight against it. He thought of Margaret, of the life he had once had. He thought of the people he had let slip away, the ones he had failed to protect. But as he struggled, the force around him tightened like a noose. The cabin walls began to pulse in time with his racing heartbeat. The figure's voice deepened, a growl now. You will serve us, Edward. You will become a part of the curse. The artifact binds you to us, forever. But then, in a final desperate act, Harper found the strength to reach inside himself, past the fear and the darkness, and he forced the words out. No. I won't. For a moment, nothing happened. The room fell into a deafening silence, and Harper's mind began to clear. But then, a low, guttural laugh rumbled from the figure, and it stepped back. You think you can defy us, Edward? You are already ours. And that was when Harper felt it. The entity was inside him, its presence suffocating, wrapping around his soul like a suffocating blanket. He had never truly been alone. It had always been there, waiting for the right moment to consume him completely. But even as he felt the final grip of the curse closing in, a thought crossed his mind. The door wasn't the only thing that had been opened. He had one final choice to make. And no matter how dark the road ahead, Harper knew he had to make it. Harper's body shook with the crushing weight of realization. The entity wasn't just a force. It was a presence, an ancient hunger that had been waiting, patient, for the right vessel. And now, as it twisted its influence around his soul, he felt himself slipping. But deep down, in the very core of his being, something ignited, a spark of resistance. With every ounce of strength, he forced his mind to focus. I still have a choice. The voices clamored, gnawing at his sanity, but he clung to his defiance. He could feel the darkness closing in, the pull of the entity's control tightening, but he refused to let it consume him entirely. He thought of Margaret again, of the love he had left behind, and the silent promise he had made to himself. I won't let it end like this. In the back of his mind, Lila's words resurfaced. Cut the connection. Sever the ties, The figure before him grew stronger, its form flickering like a broken signal. Its voice was now a maddened chorus, speaking in layers, echoing and distorting. You cannot escape, Edward. We are one now. You are the keeper. You will serve us, or you will die, slowly, painfully. Harper's pulse quickened, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The cold that surrounded him now felt suffocating, crawling beneath his skin. But something about the figure, the curse, was wrong. There was a vulnerability to it, something imperfect in its malevolent perfection. His eyes locked onto the box. The cursed artifact that had sealed his fate. It sat, innocently enough, on the table in the center of the room, almost mocking him with its silence. A realization struck him. The box, the artifact, had always been the source. The door. It wasn't just a tool for releasing the curse, it was a key. A key that he had to destroy to stop the flow. To sever the connection once and for all. The whispers and the laughter grew louder, urging him to submit. To accept the inevitability of his fate. But Harper fought against it, his resolve hardening like stone. Destroy it, the voice of Lila whispered one last time in his mind, clearer now than ever before. Destroy the artifact and break the bond. It's the only way, Without a moment's hesitation, Harper lurched forward. Every movement felt like wading through thick, dark water, but but he reached the box. His hands trembled as he lifted it from the table, feeling the ancient weight of it, the coldness that seeped into his bones. The figure before him loomed larger now, its hollow eyes watching with an almost amused expression. "Do you think you can destroy what has been in place for millennia?" the figure sneered. Its voice was full of disdain. "You are nothing. You will fail, Edward. You are already ours." Harper clutched the box tighter. The laughter surged again, but he drowned it out. With every ounce of force, he slammed the box down onto the floor. The impact sent a shockwave through the cabin, and for a moment, the air was thick with a low, mournful hum. And then, something unexpected happened. The box cracked. A hairline fracture appeared along its surface, and Harper's heart skipped a beat. The dark energy swirling around him wavered, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched. The figure hesitated, its form flickering as though unsure of what was happening. The laughter stopped. The whispers faltered. Harper's hands, now shaking uncontrollably, pressed against the crack. He pushed harder, the raw power of his will overriding the chilling pull of the curse. Just a little more, he thought. Just a little more. The crack widened, and the room seemed to groan in protest, as though the universe itself was straining against the disruption. Harper heard a final, desperate scream from the entity, a scream filled with rage and terror, as if it knew its hold was slipping. And then, with a final, violent shudder, the box shattered. The air in the cabin erupted in a rush of energy. The oppressive cold was replaced by a searing heat, and Harper felt his body lurch as if the ground itself had been torn from beneath him. The cabin walls buckled and warped, the symbols on them glowing bright with a fierce, otherworldly light. The figure, the entity, let out a bone-chilling howl, its form writhing as though it were being torn apart from the inside out. Harper fell to the ground, his vision spinning as the very world around him seemed to collapse. The whispers, the cold, the presence that had been suffocating him all this time, it all began to fade, like smoke dissipating into the air. And then, all at once, there was silence. Harper's body lay still, trembling from the aftershock of the battle he had just fought. Slowly, he pushed himself upright, his eyes scanning the cabin. It was in ruins, the walls cracked, the floor broken, but the entity was gone. The oppressive feeling that had haunted him for so long had lifted. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air was still. Harper exhaled, a deep, relieved breath that seemed to release all the fear and pain he had been holding onto for so long. His hands still shook, but now it was from the rush of triumph. He had done it. The curse was broken. But as he looked around the cabin, a thought gnawed at him, a dark thought that refused to let him rest. The box, the artifact, destroyed. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. That the entity, though broken, wasn't completely gone. As Harper stumbled out of the ruined cabin, his legs weak, his body battered, he turned one last time to look at the place where it had all started. The wind howled through the trees, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. But something caught his eye, a faint, flickering light coming from the woods just beyond the tree line. And in the stillness of the night, Harper heard the faintest whisper. Asterisk, you cannot escape us, Edward. Not forever, asterisk. His blood ran cold as the laughter began again. And somewhere in the distance, something ancient and vengeful stirred. As the darkness closes in and the whispers grow louder, one question lingers. Is it truly over? You've witnessed the horror, but remember, some curses are never fully broken. The chilling truth lies just beyond the edge of the light. Don't let it end here. Subscribe now and stay with us as we uncover the hidden horrors that lurk in the shadows. Because once you're drawn in, there's no turning back. Click that bell and join the journey into the unknown. You never know what will be waiting for you when the next door opens.